They paired it with brain scans to try to figure out why these autistic people just refuse to kill the kittens.
Welcome to It's Just ADHD. We're two curious ADHD coaches, and we're going deep on the how, the why, and the strategies to get through the difficult moments and how to make the best of life with ADHD. I'm John, and I've got an adult diagnosis of ADHD.
And I'm Tarah, and I have a late in life ADHD diagnosis and an even later autism diagnosis. We're going to be diving headfirst into the messy and often complicated research around ADHD and autism. And we're bringing you along for the journey as we break it all down and make sense of everything.
Because sometimes it's just life.
And sometimes it's just ADHD. So for today's topic, we kind of have a fun little game set up that I think will help us to talk about kind of a heavier topic, which is basically bad research. Why is there so much bad and biased research? So before we begin, I just want to remind you that this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. It is not intended to replace professional medical care. We are not doctors. We don't claim to be. We are just a couple of nerds who find this information and this research really fascinating, and we want to discuss it, but please keep your medical decisions between you and your doctor and keep us out of it. All right, let's begin.
Why is there so much bad and biased research?
Because the researchers are biased. And so in this game, I'm going to read a study setup and a conclusion to John, and he's going to guess, like, what can we draw from these results? And then I'm going to read what the researchers actually wrote based on their results, and we're going to see how much it differs.
Am I being scored on this too? Do I get like points?
We can do brownie points. We can be like, is that a reasonable conclusion to draw? Well, I'll give you a score based on reasonableness.
Cool. And I haven't seen any of this yet, by the way.
No. Yeah, he's going in sight unseen. These are just some of my cherry-picked studies that I thought were a little egregious. And the studies in particular today are going to be focusing more on autism than on ADHD. And that's because I think that ADHD has the benefit of having researchers who are kind of more in our corner. Like if you think about Russell Barkley, and like Ned Hallowell and like all of those guys, they have a nuanced understanding of ADHDers, right? Like you read their studies and their like the hypotheses that they draw, and like, have they had bad takes before? Probably. Like that's the nature of working in a field like this for your entire life. But you don't generally read their stuff and go like, that's problematic. Whereas with some of the autism research, when you read it, you're like, oh no, this is really bad.
Oh,
And
I'm
when
nervous.
and when you look at the top of the food chain too, like the more respected guys like Simon Baron Cohen, his takes are pretty bad takes. And so you can see how it percolates all the way down through all the other research from people who aren't like the industry titans, right? Now, granted, there are problems with ADHD and autism portrayal both, but I think with ADHD, it's more of a media problem. Like, I think that's more where they'll take studies that show correlation and then present it as causation. Like, they do that a lot with food stuff, right? When they're like, oh, ADHD kids don't do well with red dye, therefore did red dye cause ADHD? And you're like, no, that's not how this works. Like,
Yeah.
so I think that's more the disconnect with ADHD, whereas autism, I think some of the research itself is kind of rotten. So
Oh God.
yeah, but it's okay. This will be
Okay.
fun. We're making this fun.
Oh no. I'm so curious to see what there is. I'm not surprised it's going to be bad. I'm nervous for how bad it's going to be.
And I think with stuff like this, it's frustrating, but it's
Yeah.
healthy to laugh at it too, because there's not much that we can do besides like getting the word out and then waiting for people to catch up. And so I think in the meantime, sometimes you just have to sit back and laugh.
All right. Let's see what you got.
All right, so study number one called The Relationship Between Moral Judgment and Cooperation in Children with High Functioning Autism. And so basically, the setup for this one is they took kids who are autistic and then some kids who are allistic. That's the term for not autistic. And this is a two-part. So for part one, they would just tell these kids stories about morality, and they would say like, judge the morality of the protagonist. Is this protagonist naughty or is this protagonist nice? So does that make sense? The first part.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is going to challenge my working memory.
Well, let me know if you're not following. I can like
Okay, yeah, yeah.
re-summarize stuff. Um,
But no, I got it. Yeah, I'm locked in.
okay, so that one was called the moral judgment task. So that's where they're judging um, was the protagonist naughty or nice, and they gave him a scale of like somewhat naughty, really naughty, so that they could add a little bit of color there in
No, this is
there.
fun. There's definitely some protagonists I want to rate on this scale.
A little naughty versus really naughty. Okay.
Get into like moral gray area, like Game of Thrones. Those characters are going to be all over this. It
They
might
took
not.
a bunch of 12-year-olds and they showed them Game of Thrones. And they said,
Probably not. Probably not scientifically sound.
okay, and so here's the results, and then I'll read the conclusion to you once you decide like what we can say. So they said the autistic children had little difficulty in evaluating certain acts like hitting or sharing in terms of their morality. But compared to the allistic children, the autistic children judged harming others as significantly worse. And it
Interesting.
seemed that they were more critical of like harming a individual versus harming an object. So, John, what do you think we can conclude from that?
That autistic individuals are more sensitive to emotion and the pain they might be inflicting on others.
Yeah. And I would also add, I think that there's some really important nuance that they care more about harm to living creatures versus harm to an object.
Yeah.
I would give you a 10 out of 10 in terms of
Great.
that was a nice sound takeaway. But that is not what the researchers
Oh
concluded.
no. It feels obvious. What could they possibly have said?
They said this indicates that autistic children might have more rigid criteria for what constitutes morally naughty actions. This might be because autistic children are more rule-oriented when it comes to certain behaviors because of their disorder. For example, stereotypy, compulsive behavior, sameness, ritualistic behavior, repetitive or restrictive behaviors have all been associated with the diagnosis of autism. Therefore, the autistic children must be more rule-oriented when it comes to moral actions. Similarly, Simon Baron-Cohen argued that although autistic individuals are typically self-focused, they are highly moral people and have a strong sense of justice, and they think deeply about how to be good. So basically, they're kind of chalking it up to like, oh, they're just following the rules to a T, and not that there's like an intrinsic understanding of morality from the kids.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, nothing in there was necessarily bad. It's just like it's a long and complex way of saying that they're a little bit more rigid. But like I'm not quite sure how you get that conclusion from the study. Like, to your point about confirmation bias, it kind of feels like you're going into saying, like, we know autistic children are going to be rigid, so let's find a way to say that. Rather than, like, what I heard had a little bit more to do with emotional intelligence, the way you were phrasing it before, right? So it's like, one conclusion you could draw is they actually have a high degree of emotional intelligence, whether or not it is being portrayed at all times, right?
Yeah.
And what they're saying is like they're rigid and rule followers, which like yes, they're in autistic individuals, rule following and rigidity is part of it, but I'm not sure that that correlation was necessarily evident in the way that was framed.
I totally agree with you. But this study has a second part.
Okay,
And
okay.
the second part is they basically designed like a child-friendly version of the prisoner's dilemma.
Oh no.
So, so for folks that are not familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, it's kind of a game theory that I believe it was developed in like the 1950s. that was basically saying if you and your partner both committed a crime and they took you in for questioning, if you're both separated, it makes the most sense for both of you to not rat the other person out because in the end, you could both walk free. However, there's a world where you rat out your partner and they go to jail, they rat you out, or you both rat each other out. So it's basically a measure of how much do you like trust another person. And what they found over the last, what, 75 years, is that human beings in general tend to rat their partner out unless there's like a
Wow.
ton of trust going into it. Like they've done lots of little nuanced variations where they're like, if you've played with the same person and the last 30 times they didn't rat you out, then on the 31st time you might trust. But in general, by
Interesting.
default, we tend to rat out more often than not.
It sounds like a fun party game.
Well, so they were like, let's play this game with autistic kids. So they basically took the kids and they were like, okay, you're going to be partnering with someone who's either naughty, nice, or like a neutral, unknown person. And then they would measure how cooperative the kids are with the partner. So basically, they looked at the level of cooperativeness and came up with averages. Basically, what they concluded is the autistic kids cooperated similarly with different kinds of partners, meaning it doesn't matter if you were ranked nice, naughty, or you were a random stranger, you'd get about the same level of cooperation out of each of those kids, regardless of what your label was. With the autistic kids, they showed significantly different cooperative behavior when they were partnered with the different kinds of players. So the autistic kids were very, very cooperative with the nice child.
Interesting.
But with the random stranger or the naughty child, they were about the same level of cooperative and it was a lot less cooperative. So basically, to summarize, allistic kids are really cooperative with nice, but not cooperative with naughty or random stranger. And then the autistic kids, it was just like straight line across the board. It doesn't really matter what label you were given.
Yeah.
So, John, what would you conclude if you got
That's
those type of results?
that's fascinating. My assumption would be that the autistic kids are consistent. They're consistent, so they probably care less about what the other person is thinking of them. They're just doing the same level of performance, uh, probably trying to perform to the best they can. Whereas like the other kids um, are maybe caring what the other person thinks or are trying to like please a certain type of person. I don't really know. I don't really know how to say that. Um, so that would be my like my hot take.
Yeah, I would agree. It kind of feels like fairness to me. Like they're not
Yeah,
putting preconceived notions onto their partner and they're
right,
just being consistent. Like that would be what I would take away.
right.
I'll give you 10 out of 10 on that one too. I agree. That is not what they concluded. So, okay, so here's what they wrote. Autistic children essentially focus on their own self and have lower empathic abilities than normally developing children. While some autistic children show empathy with others and overcome their self-focus, this takes great cognitive effort. Being less interested in others and the world outside their own might lead autistic kids to pay little attention to their partner's morality when they're playing the prisoner's dilemma, even though they might have had an idea about the morality of the partner. Thus, autistic children's cooperative performance was not influenced by partner's morality, although they could correctly judge morality showed by the previous half of the study.
Again, not necessarily wrong, but the degree that it focused on like their self-interest versus just like their consistent behavior. And to your point about fairness, right? And just like treating everybody the same, the fact that they pointed it so inward, I think is fascinating.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that they would chalk it up like they were like, wow, they really can judge morality correctly, but clearly they're not using that judgment. And it's like, well, or something else is at play.
Or
And
are
and
they
I
just
don't think it's a lack of empathy.
right, right. I mean, if anything, like you could argue, and you'd have to have more research to back it up, but you could argue there's more empathy in play because they're being kind, they're being more fair to people that they might judge as, I don't know, unscrupulous or something. for whatever reason. And this is where like the details of the research are going to have to make a difference. But again, it's not like terribly wrong, but not quite the correlation that it puts out there in the beginning.
And then they go on to also say that it could be because autistic children are socially isolated. And so they say it's a long paragraph about it, but basically, high functioning children's and they use the term high functioning because it's an older study. We don't use that anymore. But autistic children's deficiency in peer relationship might lead them to perform indiscriminate cooperation when playing with the naughty and nice partners, basically because they're like not getting feedback from their peers about what is morally right and wrong, which is bizarre to me because the first half of the study, they show that not only do autistic kids judge morality correctly, but they actually are more critical of like harm to others.
Yeah, right, right.
And so it's like, I don't think that they're lacking in that sort of understanding.
It's a stretch. It's a stretch to say that it's because they're isolated that they have some flaw.
Then they continue on. The shitstorm doesn't stop. So, in addition, autistic children have typically deficits in social function based on their impairments in theory of mind and empathy, although they have normal IQ. Empathy is important for children's development of moral judgment, pro-social behaviors, and social competence. And then they talk about they've done neuroimaging, but again, they're like harping on the morality thing, even though their own study showed that the kids don't have impairment in judging morality. But then they say, thus, autistic children's deficits in social functioning might lead them to perform similar cooperation when they interacted with different moralities, even though they could judge others' morality. They're just really, really stretching.
It feels like they had a point to prove. There's a lot of confirmation bias. Like despite what the research was showing them, they just want to say the thing they wanted to say.
Yeah, yeah. And then this is their like final conclusion. Overall, this study found that both autistic children and allistic children could make correct moral judgments and that the autistic children might have even more rigid criteria for what constitutes a naughty act than allistic children, which I still, even the word rigid in that context kind of bugs me because it's like, it, I thought that they showed more ethics than the allistics.
Yeah, I mean what I hear is consistent high performer.
They go, autistic children's cooperation was similar when they played with partners of different moralities, while allistic children showed higher cooperation when they played with a morally nice child than when they interacted with a naughty child. Therefore, autistic children's cooperation was not influenced by partners' morality, while allistic children cooperation might be prompted by partners' nice morality. So, yeah, so that was kind of their conclusion. It just feels like you said they had a point to prove, and
Yeah.
it's so that was the first study. You scored a perfect score on
Awesome.
our
All right,
made-up
I'm
scale.
winning. I'm winning.
So this next one that I wanted to talk about is I didn't really want to go over like the study itself because it's kind of more of the same of this where they give autistic kids like moral judgments and they like try and trip them up. But what I found interesting was that they had this whole long section summarizing the prior work on this same topic. And I
Interesting.
thought that the way in which they summarize other people's work was also really biased.
Oh goodness.
Just to give you a little bit of color, I just wanted to pull out a quote too, just for fun. So this is just very early on in the paper. Given the mentalizing impairments that characterize individuals with autism, it might be predicted that moral judgment would be impaired in these individuals. Surprisingly, the majority of previous studies showed that individuals with autism are sensitive to moral transgressions despite a lack of theory of mind abilities. So basically, they're like, given all the mental impairments that categorize autism, you'd think that they can't judge things morally. But
Mm-hmm.
surprisingly, a majority of the studies actually showed that they are sensitive to moral transgressions, despite a lack of theory of mind.
Wow. Wow. Oh, I don't even know what to say about that.
That's just like one of the
It's
opening
like
lines in the paper.
you'd think there's something wrong with these kids. And since you think there's something wrong with these kids, you'd think they would perform poorly. But in fact, there was nothing wrong with them and they performed great. It's like,
Well, and I love the last line, despite the lack of theory of minds, they're like, even though we
yeah.
know there's something wrong with these kids, we couldn't find it.
Wow.
It's so bad. So, so then they go on to basically summarize the history of these like morality related studies with autistic, both kids and adults. And so one of the ones that gets referenced a lot is Moran et al. From 2011. So they say this tested whether autistic adults would consider both the intentions and the outcomes of a person's actions when expressing moral judgment in compared to typically developing controls. Participants read vignettes in which protagonists produced either a negative or a neutral outcome based on the belief that they were causing the negative outcome with negative belief or the neutral outcome with neutral belief. The way they phrase it is really wordy, like you probably got lost in there, but
Yeah,
basically what
yeah.
they're saying is they presented participants with a mix of stories about people who either accidentally or on purpose, like intentionally caused harm. And with that study, they wanted to judge the person's ability to account for both the intention and the outcome of the action when they're like judging, was this bad? Like, was this
Yeah.
person unethical? And so what they found, I just summarized it because it's like really wordy, but TLDR, the autistic adults tended to judge the situations more like a court of law. So if you cause harm, that's naughty, regardless of whether or not that was your intention. So, given those results, what would you conclude?
That they have a strong moral compass, that
Yeah.
they care a lot about right and wrong and hold right to a higher regard than wrong behavior.
Well, and I would argue too, it's like they look at the outcome, right? And even if you know
Yeah.
that the intentions weren't bad, if there is an outcome that harms someone else, certainly that probably should be taken into account, right?
Well, it's context, right? They're looking at it
Yeah.
with all context available, kind of like the court of law, right? That
Right.
totally tracks.
You can't murder someone just because you don't know that there's a law against murder, right? Like,
Right.
ignorance of the law is not an excuse. Well, here's what they found. The results indicated that there were no differences between participants with autism and autistic controls in their theory of mind abilities. However, adults with autism showed an over reliance on the action's negative outcome and an under reliance on information about a person's innocent intentions compared to controls. These findings indicate that individuals with autism don't integrate mental state information into moral judgments.
Okay. Fascinating. Yeah, it's like it's a really roundabout way of looking at that,
Hmm.
right? Like it's again, it's not like the correlation is like it's not entirely wrong, but it's just a weird way of getting there.
It like feels gross, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's kind of like what you're saying a minute ago, where it's like even though we know there's something wrong with these kids, we couldn't find it. And like that as a study and an outcome on its own, I think is a fine conclusion to make. Even though we think there's something wrong with these kids, we couldn't find it. Like, great, but that's not the way they're framing it.
Mhm. Well, and there's so much bias in the phrasing. Like they're like they show an over reliance on the action's negative outcome and an under reliance on the person's innocent intent. You could have phrased it as autistic people appear to value the action's outcome more than the intention of the person. That would be more
Right.
neutral language. But they almost pathologize it when they say over reliance and under reliance because they're saying that there's a norm for how much you should be relying on that information. And
Yeah.
really, I think that I would almost argue that's like cultural and that's contextual.
Yeah. You know what's bothering me about this, and I think what's bothering you too, is that these what you want in a study is to have a baseline that is consistent or fair. So you're evaluating like to like. And what's I think actually happening is instead of evaluating autistic children and behaviors against acceptable norms of autistic children and behaviors and holistic children and behaviors against accepted norms, cultural, whatever, against like, you're evaluating one against a perceived notion of what good should be or what good should look like. And so
Hmm.
you're evaluating autistic kids against some preconceived notion of what good behavior should be, which feels like bias. It
Yeah.
feels wrong. Like the baseline is thrown. They're not evaluating against the baseline. They're evaluating against something out of left field instead of
Yeah.
evaluating the autistic behavior against autistic behavior.
Well, and they're just kind of like drawing a line in the sand, and they're like, okay, this allistic behavior is the norm, and anything else is pathological.
Right.
And that's what I don't like. It's not a
Yeah.
neutral observation of like there are differences here. They're saying, okay, there's a deficit here because they get really angry when people get hurt.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's like the thing you just said. That's the important point is like they're holding them to the wrong standard. It's like saying that the allistic kids is the norm and they're deviating from the norm rather than just looking at their behavior and consistent to their group of similar peers. Now, we're talking about autism, but an ADHD diagnosis for kids, because of how it can present so differently, you cannot diagnose a kid with ADHD by looking at what you think a neurotypical kid is. It has to be evaluated within their peers.
Yeah.
And so, like, you have to have a baseline that is realistic, that takes into account the variations in neurodivergence, because everybody's going to be a little bit different. You can't hold somebody to a completely different cultural, ethical, or whatever standard that you just deem as the right one.
Yeah. Well, in that study in particular, that one by Moran, I don't know if I'm saying that right. Moran, that one from 2011 gets cited in all these other studies.
Uh,
And so it becomes this sort of snowballing effect where
right.
one person is like, oh, clearly this is some sort of weird deficit, right? And then everyone's like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then they show these studies with the same exact flavor of bias and are
Hmm.
like, we've reinforced this thing that was originally biased.
Yeah. Wow. So this is like this kind of gets me on a tangent that is kind of what you're pointing at is like I see this happen a lot. People do not know how to read statistics. They don't know how to
Hmm.
read research, and too often things are taken out of context and presented as fact
Yeah.
or truth without looking at what did that mean. And I think way too often correlation and causation are like wildly
Oh, yeah.
confused, right? Because when you look at the actual correlations in place here, the causations they're pointing to, or even the actual causations, are so different than things they're correlating,
Well,
right?
and I
And
think
so,
the part that horrifies me is that this is not because I absolutely think the correlation versus causation thing is a massive problem with journalism in the way that
yeah,
they
yeah,
portray neurodivergence
right.
because they'll grab studies. And did you know to be like a science journalist, you don't necessarily have to have like a science degree. And so they're like pulling these studies and then reading them and making these interpretations. But this is researchers misinterpreting research by other researchers. Like these
Right.
people should have the basis to be able to discern, hey, I'm drawing a causation or I'm suggesting causation. And to be clear, these are really small studies. These are like 30-person sample sizes. Like these are
Yeah,
not.
see,
And so
and
the
that's
statistical power of these is really weak.
and that's even flawed. And this happens a lot with studies. People cite these research, cite these studies
Yeah.
as if it's fact, and they repeat it when it's small sample sizes. And especially the stuff with like ADHD and autism, like so much of the research behind it is done with like college kids. A lot of research is based on stuff that happens like cohorts of college kids, and
It's
so
either college kids or 7-year-old boys.
yeah, right, right, right. And which is like it's just alarming because we live in an era where you have access to so much data that if you really wanted to understand something, it wouldn't take much to pull a really large sample size and like do organic research to prove or to uncover or show something that you wanted to point to without having to go through all of these studies that were done with weird sample sizes at weird times, oftentimes probably by an undergraduate student, right? And so it's just like people are grasping at straws just to put something out rather than really looking at the data and what the data is actually telling you. They're just looking at the way people are summarizing it because people don't know how to
Yeah.
interpret data.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to continue on with this, because there's more. In summary, previous studies show that individuals with autism are able to perform at the same level as allistic individuals in basic moral reasoning despite a lack of theory of mind. What might you conclude from that?
Yeah, that's kind of what we were saying earlier. It's like, even though we thought there's something wrong with these kids, we couldn't find anything.
But they continue on. They don't end it there.
Oh
They go,
no.
because you could leave a period there and like I might be a little unhappy with the theory of mind claim because that one actually is something that gets widely cited and is now being disputed. But anyway, they go on. They don't keep their mouth shut. Basic moral reasoning tests, which presented participants with a yes or no question to examine the acceptability of an action, have in common that they do not require individuals to explain moral decisions, but only to distinguish whether an action is good or bad. This might explain the similar performance of individuals with and without autism. So they're saying if only we had made them rationalize their judgments, then maybe we would finally find what's wrong with these people.
Wow, they're really grasping. They're really trying to prove a point here. And see,
Hmm.
and again, thinking about it, like if you're gonna look at these, if you're gonna actually draw on this research to say something or prove something, look at the data, right? There's data. They're telling you the data. The problem is they're interpreting it in a way that, for whatever reason, benefits them in some way, right? They
Yeah.
have something to prove, something to say, so they're interpreting the data in a very skewed way. But as I think, as we've been talking about, and as you've kind of shown, there's other ways to interpret this data that are probably better, that are probably more fair, that I think is even a more interesting take, right? The whole take of like, we thought there was something wrong. Like everything you told me is like, we thought there was something wrong with these kids, and and we couldn't find it. Like that's an interesting take, right? That's an interesting article right there. That's interesting research. But it's like they go out of their way to add to that. But there's definitely something wrong with these kids, right? Like
Well, and they go on later in this summary to talk about the research where they did have autistic individuals explain their rationale for moral judgment. And they go, instead of offering more novel thoughts, they tended to reiterate parts of the story itself instead of offering like a novel explanation. So
so
therefore they must not understand it. And I'm like, or they're citing their sources.
yeah, right.
Like if they're giving verbatims from the story, that reads to me as like, oh wow, they're citing their sources with things that are like objective for why they would judge something as bad, right? Like if you're like,
Yeah.
why did you think that that person is bad? And you're like, because she kicked the cat. That doesn't read as a deficit to me. That reads as like, duh. Versus like if somebody else is like, well, kicking cats is bad because cats have feelings. I don't think either of those people have some sort of deficit, but they're saying, oh, the person who said because she kicked the cat, well, they're just regurgitating. So they must not fully understand why they think that that's unethical.
If anything, you've showed me a case for why autistic people should be in charge.
It's like they're they're predictable, they're consistent.
High
They
performers.
they cite their sources for why
Yeah.
they think something is bad. And everyone is like, wow, what a deficit.
And there's something wrong with them.
Okay, so I have one more study for you.
Our
This
world
is
is upside down.
This one's my favorite because it is so crazy. It actually got kind of popular on Reddit, and people have made cartoons about it because everyone thinks this study is so crazy. But anyway, this is a study out of Brazil where they set up two trials. I think it was with like teenagers. So in one, there are like two different possibilities. In one situation, the person could lose money and donate to like a good charity that supports education for kids in Brazil. So option one, half the cohort, you can donate $10 to support education in Brazil. In a separate cohort, separate group of people, participants could gain money, but also be forced to contribute to a bad charity to literally kill cats and dogs on the streets of Brazil. And so with that one, it was like, we'll give you $10 and we're also going to donate $10 to this charity that kills puppies and kittens. So then in both in a public setting and in private, they asked like, do you want to take the deal? And what they found is that autistic individuals were overall more likely to reject the kitten killing offer, and their responses didn't change whether they were in public or in private.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
What would you conclude from that?
Oh man. So that again, they're consistent. They care a lot about empathy, the well-being of others, other creatures, that they don't want to cause harm.
Yeah, sounds reasonable. Not at all what they concluded.
How can you get anything else from that?
Stay tuned.
Oh no.
They go first. Autistic individuals, unlike healthy control subjects, blurred the distinction between private and public conditions when making moral decisions. This finding not only coheres with the theory of mind deficit hypothesis of autistic individuals, but also agrees with the previous findings using a trade-off between suffering personal losses and donating to a good cause. And so, theory of mind, for folks that don't know, is basically a skill that you develop in like normal childhood development where you are aware of the knowledge and the mental cognition of someone outside of yourself. So like the way that they'll test it is they'll put pencils in like a Smarties container and they'll ask the kid, what do you think is in there? And so it's labeled Smarties. So they go Smarties. And then they open it up and they show them that it's pencils. And then if they close it back up and they say, well, if I show this to your mom, what's your mom going to think is in here? Well, a kid lacking in theory of mind would say pencils because they wouldn't understand that the mom doesn't have the context that the kid has. And so at some point, at some age, I don't know much about child development. I don't know what age it comes in, but at some point you gain the ability to be like, oh, my mom doesn't know it's pencils. My mom would still think it's Smarties. So they're saying that because the autistic people in both public and private said no to the killing the kittens, that supports the hypothesis that they lack theory of mind.
That's not at all what it said. Wow.
So then they also go, moreover, it extends the lack of attention to social reputation in autism to include an immoral context where individuals are confronted with a moral conflict between personal profits and a cost brought by benefiting an immoral cause. This first finding confirms that autistic individuals do not appear to take into account their social reputation while making immoral or moral choices consistently across contexts.
That's not at all what it said. Like it has where did they gain social reputation and like no, it's that they understand morality, as that they understand harm and they are consistent.
And they really spin out on this. Like, I have a bunch of quotes pulled that I
Yeah.
won't subject you guys to, but basically, they could not figure out why the autistic individuals and the control group, both at about the same rate, would do the charity one, like the positive charity one. I think they said it was like 60% of the time they would donate to the good charity. And they were like, they don't have a deficit here. But the autistic people really didn't want to kill the kittens. And so they couldn't figure out how to reconcile those two.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like they go, furthermore, this effect cannot be attributed to their greater dislike for the morally bad cause because there was no significant between group difference on subjective ratings.
Yeah, the data there says something about behavior, ethics, morality, but it doesn't exactly say what they're telling us.
Yeah.
It says.
They paired it with brain scans to try to figure out why these autistic people just refuse to kill the kittens.
Wow, so you're telling me the data alone it wasn't giving them enough, and so they had to look at their brain to figure out what else was wrong with them because they wouldn't kill kittens. Like that,
They
just the
did
fact
brain
that,
scans. They also did a bunch of like regression modeling, which is basically where you take a bunch of data points and try and come up with a formula. And so they came up with all these different formulas to model like the dollar value of like at what point will people kill kittens? How much money will it take? They just really could not wrap their brains around this. And like
I
they
mean,
wrote,
it's a little macabre, but like that's an interesting study. Like, what dollar amount do people want to kill kittens? I find that a very fascinating
and it's
thing
very
to
different if
explore.
you're autistic. And
Yeah.
that could be the conclusion itself, right? And
Right,
they're
but
like,
yeah, yeah, exactly. That could be the conclusion itself. It's like they're focused on the wrong thing. They're paying attention to the wrong data point.
well, and similar to the study earlier, they also tried to contribute it to rigidity. They go, it is possible that behavioral rigidity, at least to some extent, is a more general mechanism that contributes to the inflexibly moral behaviors in the bad context, meaning that 85% of people who were autistic rejected the kitten killing thing. But this should be treated with caution because it seems to not account well for the behaviors of autistic participants in the good context, where they behaved in a comparatively more flexible fashion, where 60% of them chose to contribute to a good charity.
Well, I mean, again, like giving saying rigidity as bad and flexible as good, like giving those like good and bad binaries, it just feels biased and wrong.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too that you see the language getting mirrored, where the previous study that we had talked about too, they were like, maybe it's rigidity, and these guys as well. Maybe it's rigidity, although it doesn't really fit the fact that like half of them give to
Yeah.
charity, but most of them won't kill kids. But they're like, but it's worth considering. And so that's where you again see that snowball effect, where the language gets parroted over and over without really looking critically at like, does it fit?
Yeah, yeah. So, what have we learned here today?
I think what we've learned is that the research itself, like each one of these papers, are kind of goofy, right? It's not a ton of statistical power. It's like 30 participants, but it's a snowball effect because these aren't isolated. I mean, I think the killing kittens one is probably one of the most egregious ones. When you take them all in aggregate, and researchers are saying like, well, this research reinforces the prior research, and you keep perpetuating these myths,
Yeah.
it creates real harm. And I mean, I would argue even an individual study can cause harm from the standpoint that like a journalist can pick it up and quote it, kind of like we talked about earlier. But when you have many, many, many studies repeating the same crap, it's dangerous and it creates these perceptions that like autistic people are like don't understand morality, that autistic people don't understand that other people have like a different thinking than themselves.
Especially if the people that are repeating these stories are repeating the conclusions or summaries of the studies that have been done without looking at the underlying data and whether or not it's good or solid or they agree or the sample size makes sense or that it like is valid or holds up at all, right? I think,
Really a lack of like critical examination
yeah,
of the studies that came before, and then they continue to perpetuate. And so, yeah, I think that this is a huge problem for autistic folks. I think that's part of why there's so much stigma. And I think it's a shame that the very people that are supposed to be helping us by doing research are hurting us.
it goes to question why are they doing the research and who are they set out to benefit and what are they actually trying to prove?
Yeah, it makes me feel like a zoo animal a little bit, right? Because it's like they've got them in a cage and they're observing them and they're like, wow, the zoo animal like is pooping in the corner. And you're like, yeah, where else would I poop? But they're like, fascinating. What a peculiar creature.
Right, right. Well, what I've learned is that autistic kids are extremely consistent.
Yeah.
They are very ethical and they're moral. That people don't know how to interpret data or read data or summarize research conclusions.
Well, and I think a big takeaway for listeners as well, read the papers, right? Like, don't
Yeah.
just stop and like look at like, I know it's tempting to just read articles that summarize research, but you don't know if what you're reading is one of these studies. And so I think if you feel able to like interpret research, and I know that it's very verbose, like I'm sure y'all got lost in some of these quotes that I was reading. I had to reread it a bunch of times and like pull the quotes out myself, but I think taking that extra moment to actually look critically at the research and be like, what would I conclude? And does that match? Like, look at the experiment design and the setup and stuff. That all matters. You can't just look at the conclusion, because if I just read the conclusion on these, I'd be like, wow, autistic kids, they just really don't understand.
You've been missing a bunch of context. Well, and I think even another step would be look at who's funding
Yeah.
the research and what's going into it and why they're funding it.
Yeah.
Because I can
Yeah. And
tell
I
you a lot
think
about why it was done.
huge shame too is like Simon Baron Cohen is a name you'll see come up a lot, and we'll do a lot more content on him in like coming episodes. But he's one of the most well-respected autism researchers, and he's the one that came up with the theory of mind deficit. Among other awful things, like he has called autism the extreme male brain theory. So even autistic women, he's like, well, you just have an extreme male brain. And so they quote him. He's so well respected. He runs the like autism research department in the Cambridge University. He's been knighted in the UK because
How on earth does that hold up?
and he has written the AQ, which is one of the diagnostic tests for autism. And so you see this snowballing effect because it's like this head researcher
Yeah.
who believes all these like wacky things writes the diagnostic criteria that gets used by clinicians to diagnose autism. And
Mm,
so they like him and some of these other researchers have painted the collective understanding not of just the general public, but also of clinicians themselves. And so no wonder so many people get missed when they're evaluating based on criteria written by a guy who believes in the extreme male brain theory.
that's unfortunate.
The whole thing feels like it's built on sand.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for playing this game with me.
Yeah, it was fun. Uh I mean, at least we found a fun way to get through that, to talk about
Yeah,
some of that. You gotta laugh. You gotta
yeah.
laugh. Well, I mean, I think at least I won the game, right?
I think we should rewrite all the conclusions and have you keep it short and simple.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much for tuning in and listening to the episode, and hopefully this helps everyone understand the research that goes into this and the different voices that make this up and the voices that are missing.
Yeah, yeah. Simon Baron Cohen has been criticized for not listening to the autistic community in some of his experiment design, to the extent that some of his more modern studies have been shut down.
Wow.
Yeah, but he's the face of autism research.
Still there.
Still there. Yeah, we'll be back with more episodes. We'll bring you the good, the bad, and the ugly of all the research.
Yes, we will.